When Totally Awesome, one of the best boss monsters in the game, was released, it was reasonable to think that frogs, a forgotten archetype since the elimination of their ridiculously easy OTK-FTK combination, would once again rise to the competitive ranks of Yu-Gi-Oh! Unfortunately for the amphibians, this rise was sidetracked by the rapid increase in popularity of Paleozoics, which in a sense stole Totally Awesome and ran to the competitive front itself. Now, it is obvious that Paleozoics have had a lot of success competitively, largely due to Totally Awesome. But I have always wondered whether or not the right deck rose to the top. Were Paleozoics really better with Totally Awesome than frogs? As a lead-in to addressing that question, let's look at my updated frog deck. Not surprisingly, the main deck star for the frog deck is Swap Frog. With another water monster in hand, Swap is a one-card Totally Awesome thanks to its innate special summoning ability, its foolish burial effect, and bounce ability. In addition, it helps provide more fuel to support additional Totally Awesome summonings in the future turns if the opponent gets over the initial Totally. 3 copies are basically mandatory. The next most important monster in the Frog arsenal is Ronintoadin. However, because Ronin cannot banish itself, and Link summoning has dampened the ability to spam the board with extra deck monsters, I like only running 2 copies instead of 3 copies. The main advantage of Ronin is the ability to work with Swap Frog to break down the ability of the opponent to keep Totally Awesomes off the board. With this combination, you don't just summon one Totally in a given turn, but multiple Totally Awesomes. Therefore, unless the opponent has multiple counter traps to negate the summons of Totally, Awesome will either be on the board or you will have taken multiple opponent resources and be ready to summon an Awesome during your next turn. This is one of the advantages that frog-centric builds have over the Paleozoic build, because it is much more probable to get that awesome first turn. Continuing with the Froggy Brigade, I run 3 copies of Flip-Flop Frog, a rather underrated monster which can act as a nice support card for Toadally, stalling element, and at worst, fuel for either Swap or Ronin when it gets thrown in the graveyard. Flip-Flop is also supported nicely by another card in this deck, which will be discussed later. Most of the time, Flip-Flop is the monster of choice I like to summon off of Awesome's standby phase effect during the opponent's turn, because with its ability to bounce monsters during your next turn, it will be a priority of removal for the opponent. A somewhat staple in most past Frog decks, not surprisingly, I run 3 copies of Dupe Frog, which is a nice defensive wall at 2000 defense, can force fall attacking completely if it has a partner Dupe Frog on the field, and a means to commonly net a frog-based search, which will almost always be Swap Frog to help jumpstart any more awesome combinations. Dupe also works nicely with Dark Hole in this deck, allowing a search while potentially clearing the opponent's field of monsters, and then setting up for an awesome summon. In my opinion, for the non-frog monsters, Graydles offer an excellent complementary offensive and defensive strategy. Not only do the water attributes of Graydles allow Swap Frog to use them for its effect, but their monster theft ability provides a significant level of offensive capacity for the deck, helping to remove defensive obstacles that the 2200 Totally Awesome can't hit over. In some sense, I feel Graydles were always intended to be a complementary element to certain decks, never a central hybrid player that some attempted to make them in decks like Graydle Kaijus. The inclusion of Graydles can also force the opponent to make difficult decisions against face-down targets when your initial plays may not immediately come together. For the Graydle group, I run 3 copies of Eagle, 2 copies of Cobra, and 2 copies of Graydle Slime Jr. I prefer Cobra over Alligator because in my experience, most of the time I end up just suiciding a Graydle into a monster, and that 500 extra attack is 500 less life you have to lose. Finally, closing out the monsters, I run 1 copy of Aquaactress Tetra for its ability to acquire an Aquarium Stage and as a target for Transmodify. 1 copy of Eater of Millions, which works great with Totally Awesome at removing those annoying obstacles that Totally cannot get over itself, and then Totally can watch Eater's back for any type of pesky monster negation effects the opponent may use to try to derail Eater. and one copy of Timebreaker Magician. Timebreaker may stick out like a sore thumb of sorts in this deck, but I run it to remove annoying monsters as well as remove an awesome in order to summon a second awesome without needing a link monster, and then during my next standby phase, both the Magician and the first awesome come back. Thus, I have two awesomes on the field. I do this because it's typically for this deck, it's priority to get an awesome on the field, which will take up that extra deck spot instead of a link monster. For the spells, I run one copy of Raigeki, one copy of Soul Charge, and two copies of Dark Hole as reasonable staples, one copy of Upstart Goblin for increased speed as typical. The additional 1,000 life points is rather irrelevant. Two copies of Transmodify work nicely for fielding a Graydle after a Ronin's graveyard summon to remove a pesky opponent monster and take it for your own, or even bring out a Swap Frog or a Ronin off of a Tetra. Revival is an interesting choice for this deck. I prefer two copies of Surface over a card like Call of the Haunted, for while Surface cannot special summon Toadally Awesome from the graveyard, its normal spell standing allows it to be used during your turn without waiting that turn, which is especially important, I feel, early in the duel for establishing a Toadally on the board. I run two copies of Scapegoat in order to make link summoning more probable, to facilitate the ability to get multiple Toadally Awesomes on the field at once, and as a stall mechanism, because this deck does have the ability to break fields rather effectively if you can buy a little time and draw one or two cards here or there, and Scapegoat does help you do that. Finally, closing out the spells, I run two copies of Aquarium Stage to significantly reduce the ability of an opponent to remove Toadally Awesome by protecting it from battle destruction by all non-water monsters, and in this meta, that's basically every monster. When the opponent finally attempts to remove Aquarium Stage, through most means, it's going to go to the graveyard, and you'll be able to get an Aqua monster, which is going to either be another Toadally Awesome, or a Graydle that you can then turn around to use against your opponent. For the traps, I like running one Torrential Tribute as a field clearer, three copies of Lost Wind, which serves the double purpose of both helping to support the negation effects of Toadally. Lost Wind can negate something instead of Toadally, which saves Toadally's negation for something else. It also then halves the attack points of a potential monster that Toadally could not normally beat over. Finally, I run two copies of Dark Bribe. The reason I run Dark Bribe is quite simple: to counter those annoying counter traps like Solemn Strike that can really hurt the viability of Toadally. The extra draw for the opponent is rather worthless for the momentum Bribe helps maintain for this deck, and there are a limited number of options that the opponent can draw off of the Dark Bribe draw that would be worse for you than what you're actually doing with Dark Bribe. Some may ask, where's the Moray of Greed, largely due to the importance of getting Swap Frog in the opening hand. The problem I have with Moray is, in my experience, it hurts me as a dead draw more often than it helps me to grab a swap during the first turn. This deck is a grindy deck. You're really not going to OTK anybody with this deck, especially in Link format. So drawing Moray later in the duel is almost always a dead draw, since I don't run Salvage. Another option is Ties of the Brethren, for one can summon a Swap, Flip-Flop, and a Dupe, with any one of those and Brethren grabbing the other two from the deck. I have previously stated in other deck builds my distaste for Brethren as a card, that because I feel it's only valuable first turn, and in this deck, the no special summoning ability really hurts, because you have to wait that extra turn to get Awesome on the field, and the net benefit from its use is really not that helpful. Brethren really shines in decks where advantage can be gained off of summons without having to special summon, like Bujin. This is not the deck for Ties of the Brethren, in my opinion. For the extra deck, I run one Graydle Dragon, one Tornado Dragon, one number 106 Giant Hand, one Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer. Now, some people might be wondering, wait a minute, what are you running rank 4s for in this deck when you don't have level 4 monsters? Well, over the course of various duels, you will be stealing monsters with your Graydles, and sometimes you'll steal a couple 4s and might want to make an XZ. Overall, the extra deck space in this deck is pretty loose. 3 Toadally Awesome, 2 Sky Cavalry Centaurea, 1 Daigusto Phoenix, 1 Herald of Pure Light, 1 Gachi, and finally the Link Monster Spider combo that's easily available when normal tokens are available, like from Scapegoat, 2 Spiders and 1 Mrs. Radiant. Now the Radiant might be replaced later on with that new Starboy Water Link monster when it comes out, but for now, Mrs. Radiant. In the end, to address the original question of whether or not frogs were a better deck than Paleozoics, I think before Link Summoning, Paleos definitely had the edge on frogs, largely because of their explosive potential. But now with Link Summoning, the overall explosiveness of Paleos has been diminished, as well as the quality versatility provided for by their unique XZ monsters, which offered very effective complements to Toadally Awesome. The loss of efficiency has allowed frogs to scamper ahead in my eyes. Right now, I like this deck better than the Paleo build because it has a better first turn and a more consistent ability to continuously put Awesome on the field. However, similar to the Paleo build, this deck is definitely a control deck, and Link Summoning has slowed it down as well. For most of the time, the major point of this deck is to summon an Awesome, not spend resources putting a Link monster on the field first to support multiple Awesome. This slowdown can be frustrating at times because the overall pace of the game can slow, but this is also where smart play comes to the forefront. Well, that is my frog deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.